The frost on Morrison's general store window caught the late afternoon light like shattered glass. Adelaide Harper stood at the counter, her fingers wrapped around the handle of a carpenter's saw, and for a moment she couldn't let go. "That'll be $1, the storekeeper said, already reaching for the coin box. She released it. The wood was still warm from her grip. Thomas had bought this saw their first year of marriage, when the Montana territory was newer and their future stretched ahead like the prairie itself. She remembered him testing the blade against his thumb, nodding with satisfaction, carrying it home like a prize. Now it sat on Morrison's counter with the casual indifference of any other merchandise. "And these," Adelaide said, sliding the planes across the scarred wood surface. Morrison counted out coins with practiced efficiency. Near the stove, a rancher she didn't know stood warming his hands, his hat pushed back, watching. Adelaide felt his gaze but didn't meet it. There was no room for shame in survival. Her mother had always said, but her mother had never stood in a general store selling off a dead husband's tools to buy another week of food. Two other customers browsed the shelves, a woman examining fabric, a farmer testing the weight of an axe. The November wind rattled the door. Morrison waited. Adelaide reached for the chisels next. Thomas had kept these wrapped in oiled cloth, the blades sharp enough to shave wood into ribbons so thin you could see lamplight through them. She'd watched him work countless evenings, the cabin filled with the sweet smell of pine and cherry, his hands moving with the confidence of true skill. $1.50 for the set, Morrison offered. She nodded. The coins clinked into her palm, cold and insufficient. The pile of tools on the counter diminished. Each piece carried a memory she was selling by the pound. The brace and bits Thomas had used to hang their cabin door, the smoothing plane that had finished their table, where they'd eaten 8 years of meals together, the marking gauge he'd made himself from scrap oak, when only one tool remained in her canvas sack. Adelaide's hand trembled, reaching for it. The level was different from the others. Thomas had crafted it himself from a length of cherry wood, precisely balanced. The bubble vial set with a craftsman's care. His initials were carved into the handle TH. She'd watched him make it during their second winter, working by firelight, explaining that a level never lied, it showed you true, even when you didn't want to see it. This was the last piece of Thomas she owned that had value. Morrison leaned forward, assessing. "Cherry wood, handmade. I'll give you $2 for it." Adelaide lifted the level from her sack. The wood was smooth as water, darkened by years of Thomas's hands. She placed it on the counter between them, her fingers still touching it. The store seemed very quiet suddenly. Even the wind had paused. "And this one," she whispered. A hand appeared in Adelaide's peripheral vision, gentle but firm, stopping her motion before she could slide the level across the counter to Morrison. "Ma'am," a voice said, "I'll buy all of them." Adelaide looked up sharply. The rancher from the stove had moved closer, his weathered face serious, but not unkind. He was perhaps 40, with the sun-creased eyes of a man who worked outdoors, his coat dusted with the fine powder of Montana winter. $20, he continued. "For everything you've sold in that level there." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "That's more than generous. Carter." Adelaide's mind struggled to catch up. $20 was a month's rent, 6 weeks of careful food, a winter's worth of lamp oil and firewood. It was also impossible. "I don't understand," she said. The rancher Carter removed his hat. "I need a barn built before the hard weather sets in. My foreman broke his leg last week, and I've got good men but none with the eye for proper construction. I'll need someone to supervise the work. Tell my crew how things should be done right." "I'm not a carpenter," Adelaide said immediately. "No, ma'am, I don't imagine you are." Carter's expression remained steady. "But you lived with one. Didn't you, the best carpenter this territory's seen? From what I hear of Thomas Harper's work." The sound of her husband's name in a stranger's mouth startled her. Carter continued before she could respond. "You know his standards, his methods. That knowledge is worth wages to me. $2 a day if you'll supervise the construction and tell my men how your husband would have done it." Morrison snorted softly. "A woman supervising a building crew." Carter ignored him. His attention focused entirely on Adelaide. She felt the weight of it, the seriousness of the offer, but also the impossibility. What did she know about building barns she'd watched Thomas work? Yes. Listen to him explain joinery and load distribution and 100 other technical matters. But watching wasn't doing. Listening wasn't knowing. "I can't," she began. $2 a day, Carter repeated. "Work starts tomorrow if you're willing. The foundation's laid, the timber's ready. Winter's coming hard and I need that barn finished. This isn't charity, Mrs. Harper. It's practical need." Adelaide looked down at the level between them. Thomas's initials caught the lamplight. She thought about the coins from the tools she'd already sold, barely enough for 2 weeks of careful living. She thought about the coming winter. The landlord who'd already extended her rent deadline twice. The dwindling options of a childless widow with no family. "I wouldn't know where to start," she said quietly. "You'd start by showing my men these tools and explaining what each one's for." Carter said, "Then you'd look at the work and ask yourself what Thomas Harper would do. That's all I'm asking." The woman examining fabric had stopped to listen. The farmer with the axe stood motionless. Morrison waited with poorly concealed skepticism. Adelaide felt the attention like a physical weight, but beneath the fear, something else stirred. Thomas had always said good work speaks truth. He'd believed in doing things right, not just done. If this rancher needed that knowledge, if Thomas's understanding of craft could still have value in the world, "When do I start?" Adelaide heard herself say. Carter's expression didn't change, but something eased in his shoulders. "Tomorrow morning. I'll send a wagon at first light." He counted $20 onto the counter in front of Morrison, then gathered Adelaide's tools, her tools now, she supposed, back into the canvas sack. When he handed it to her, the weight felt different. Not lighter, but changed somehow. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," he said, settling his hat back on his head. Adelaide nodded, unable to speak, and watched him walk out into the November afternoon. The wagon arrived as promised, driven by a Mexican man who introduced himself as Miguel and spoke little during the journey to Carter's ranch. Adelaide sat beside him with the tool sack clutched in her lap, watching the Montana landscape roll past in shades of gray and brown. November had stripped the cottonwoods bare. The prairie grass lay flat beneath a sky heavy with the promise of snow. They passed a creek running dark between frozen banks, a distant line of mountains, a cluster of cattle huddled against the wind. Adelaide barely saw any of it. Instead, she saw Thomas. 8 years they'd had. 8 years of marriage in a small cabin Thomas had built with his own hands. Every board placed true. Every joint fitted perfect. She'd been 19 when they met, the daughter of a seamstress, and he'd been 26, already earning a reputation for work that lasted. They'd married 3 months after their first conversation. She remembered those years in fragments now. Thomas at the work table, lamplight catching the curl of wood shavings, the smell of pine and cherry and walnut, his patient voice explaining why certain joints were stronger than others, why weight needed to be distributed just so, why good work required understanding the materials you worked with. Just for conversation. He'd always said when she asked why he was teaching her these things, "A man likes to share what he knows with his wife." She'd never imagined she'd need that knowledge. Pneumonia had taken him in April. So sudden she'd barely understood what was happening. 1 week he was coughing, the next he was gone. 6 months now, and the cabin still felt like he might walk through the door at any moment. Dust on his clothes, tools in his hands. But he wouldn't, and the landlord wanted his rent, and the winter was coming. And the tools she'd carried to Morrison's store were all she had left of value in the world. Until now. Miguel turned the wagon off the main trail. Ahead, Adelaide saw buildings taking shape, a ranch house, corrals, a bunkhouse, and in the cleared space beyond them, the skeletal framework of new construction. The foundation was laid in neat stone, thick timbers already positioned for the walls. Stacks of lumber sat covered with canvas. 3 men stood near a wagon loaded with supplies. And as Miguel drove closer, they turned to watch. Adelaide's stomach tightened. This was real. Not just an agreement made in the desperate moment of a general store, but actual construction. Actual men who would look to her for guidance she wasn't certain she possessed. The wagon stopped. Miguel climbed down and offered his hand to help her. Adelaide stepped onto solid ground, the tool sack heavy against her side. Boone Carter emerged from the ranch house and crossed the yard toward them. In daylight, his face showed more lines, more years of weather and work, but his expression held the same steady seriousness from yesterday. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "Welcome. Let me introduce you to the crew." He led her toward the 3 waiting men. Adelaide's boots crunched on frozen ground. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Everything felt too bright, too real, too impossible. "This is Sam, my ranch foreman," Carter said, gesturing to a gray-haired man with kind eyes. "He knows building well enough, but he's got a ranch to run too. This is Dutch, who does most of our carpentry work." Dutch was younger, maybe 30, with skeptical eyes that assessed Adelaide with obvious doubt. He nodded politely, but said nothing. "And you've met Miguel?" Miguel smiled slightly. "Ma'am?" Adelaide looked at the 3 of them, then at Carter. Then at the construction site with its promise and its terrible weight of expectation. She told Carter she didn't know where to start. Standing here now, with the wind cutting through her coat and the men watching her with varying degrees of curiosity and doubt, she felt the truth of that more than ever. But Thomas's voice was in her head, calm and patient. "Start with what you know." Adelaide set the tool sack down and looked at the foundation, the timbers, the stacked lumber. "Show me what you've done so far," she said, "and tell me what comes next." The first morning felt like play acting. Adelaide unpacked Thomas's tools with hands that wanted to shake, laying each piece on a clean section of lumber while the 4 men watched. The saw, the planes, the chisels, the brace and bits, the marking gauge, finally, the cherry wood level. "My husband made this," she said, holding it up. "He said a level never lies. It shows you true." Dutch crossed his arms. Sam nodded thoughtfully. Miguel stepped closer to examine it. "What I know about building," Adelaide continued. "I know because Thomas explained it while he worked. He believed good construction required understanding why things were done, not just how." She set the level down carefully. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice held steady. "Show me what you've planned for the walls." Sam produced a rough sketch. The barn would be 30 feet by 40. Timber frame construction with board siding, pitched roof for snow load, standard Montana barn design, practical and efficient. Adelaide studied it, hearing Thomas's voice in her memory. "Always think about how weight moves through a structure. The corner posts need to be set deep," she said. 18 inches minimum, packed with stone for drainage. "Already done," Sam said, pointing to the foundation. "Set them last week." Adelaide walked to the nearest corner and crouched to examine it. The post stood true, the stone packing tight and level. She ran her hand along the timber, feeling for the quality Thomas had taught her to recognize. Straight grain, no splits, properly seasoned. "Good work," she said. She saw surprise flicker across Sam's face. Approval. Maybe? Dutch remained skeptical. The morning progressed in careful increments. Adelaide asked questions, examined the timber, tried to channel 8 years of listening to Thomas explain his craft. When Dutch asked about joist placement for the floor, she felt a spike of panic she didn't know. Not for certain. But then she remembered Thomas building their cabin floor, explaining how joists needed to be spaced based on the lumber's thickness and the expected load. 16 inches for floor joists, he'd said, to prevent sagging and provide solid footing. 16 inches center to center, Adelaide said. The weight needs distribution across multiple supports. Dutch frowned. I usually do 18. That might work for lighter use, Adelaide said, forcing confidence into her voice. But a barn floor carries hay wagons, equipment, cattle sometimes. The closer spacing prevents sag. They tried it her way. By midday, the floor joists were in place, and Dutch had to admit the framework felt solid as stone. Miguel approached her during the lunch break, pulling off his work gloves. Ma'am, that joinery you mentioned for the corner braces, could you show me? I'd like to learn. Adelaide blinked. Teaching had never occurred to her. She was barely competent herself. But Miguel's expression held genuine interest, and she found herself sketching in the dirt with a stick, explaining how mortise and tenon joints worked, how the interlocking pieces distributed stress. Thomas always said to work with the wood's nature, not against it. She told him. See how the grain runs in this timber you cut with that direction for strength. Miguel nodded, studying her rough diagram with concentration. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Adelaide stood back and watched the men work. The barn floor was taking shape, joists laid true and level, corner posts standing solid. It wasn't her work, her hands hadn't driven a single nail, but her knowledge had guided it. Thomas's knowledge? She corrected herself. But maybe there was value in being the keeper of that knowledge, the voice that remembered and transmitted what he'd understood. When Carter appeared to check the progress, he walked the floor framework with careful attention, testing joints, sighting along the timbers. Finally, he looked at Adelaide. This is fine work, Mrs. Harper. Better than I'd hoped. Dutch packed up his tools with less skepticism than he'd shown that morning. Sam nodded to Adelaide as he left, and Miguel paused before heading to the bunkhouse. Tomorrow could you show me that joinery technique you mentioned? He asked. For the corner braces. Adelaide nodded, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Tomorrow, she agreed. As the wagon carried her back to town in the gathering dusk, Adelaide held the tool sack in her lap and thought about the day. She'd been terrified, uncertain, convinced she'd fail, but the floor joist stood true. The work was good. And tomorrow she'd teach Miguel about joinery. Maybe this was possible after all. 3 weeks passed and December settled over Montana with serious cold. Adelaide fell into a rhythm she hadn't expected, arriving at the ranch each morning as frost still glazed the timbers, reviewing the previous day's progress, solving problems by asking herself what Thomas would do. The men had stopped watching her with skepticism. They listened now when she explained why certain techniques mattered, nodded when she approved their work, made adjustments when she suggested improvements. The barn rose from its foundation like something growing, walls framed and braced, windows placed for light and ventilation. Miguel asked questions constantly, and Adelaide discovered she could answer them, not because she'd done the work herself, but because she'd absorbed Thomas's understanding through 8 years of marriage. She knew why diagonal bracing prevented racking. She knew how to calculate roof pitch for snow load. She knew which joints would hold under stress and which would fail. Teaching Miguel felt different than supervising the work. When she explained how to cut a proper mortise, she heard Thomas's voice in her own words, felt his patience in her demonstrations. The knowledge wasn't just remembered anymore, it was becoming hers, transformed through the act of transmission. One evening in mid-December, Adelaide stayed late to examine a wall section that troubled her. The men had left. The winter sun was setting red beyond the mountains, and she stood alone in the half-finished barn, running her hand along a completed frame. Solid. True. Good work? She'd been so focused on preserving Thomas's memory that she hadn't noticed she was building something new. This barn wasn't his, he'd never seen it, never designed it, would never know it existed. But his understanding lived in every joint, every carefully placed timber, every decision she'd made about how things should be done. The grief hadn't disappeared. It still caught her at unexpected moments, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the angle of afternoon light through boards, the weight of tools in her hands. But it was changing shape, becoming less like a wound and more like a foundation. Footsteps crunched on frozen ground. Adelaide turned to see Boone Carter approaching with 2 tin cups of coffee. Steam rising in the cold air. "Thought you might need warming," he said, offering her one. Adelaide accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the cup's heat. They stood together in the skeletal barn, breathing steam, watching the sunset paint the mountains. "My father built this ranch," Carter said after a long silence. "Started with nothing but determination and 100 head of cattle. Worked himself half to death trying to make it prosper." Adelaide waited, sensing he had more to say. "He died 5 years ago," Carter continued. "Left me this place and a legacy I wasn't sure I could honor. Every decision I make, I ask myself what he would do. But lately I've been wondering if that's the right question." "What should you ask instead?" Adelaide said. "Maybe what I would do, informed by what he taught me." Carter looked at her directly. "You're not just preserving your husband's knowledge, Mrs. Harper. You're making it yours, applying it to problems he never faced. That's different than simple remembering." The words settled into Adelaide like warmth. She looked around the barn at the walls she'd supervised, the techniques she'd explained. The work that had come from Thomas's understanding filtered through her own judgment. "I think Thomas would have liked this barn," she said quietly. "I think he'd be proud of the builder," Carter replied. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. When Adelaide finally left, climbing into the wagon for the ride back to town, something had shifted in her chest. The grief was still there, but it had company now, purpose, and the first tentative edges of something that might become peace. The next morning, Miguel showed her a practice mortise and tenon joint he'd cut the previous evening. The fit was perfect, the angles precise, the work confident. "You're a good teacher, ma'am," he said. Adelaide studied the joint, seeing Thomas's standards reflected in a young man's learning, and smiled. The argument started over mathematics. Late December had brought the frame to completion, and now they faced decisions about the roof. Adelaide had spent the previous evening calculating pitch angles, using methods Thomas had taught her, accounting for Montana's heavy snow loads and the barn's dimensions. 22.5 degrees, she told the crew that morning, showing her figures. Dutch studied them with a frown. "That's steeper than standard. Drives up the cost in lumber and labor. It prevents collapse." Adelaide said, "The snow load here can reach 3 feet in a hard winter. A shallower pitch means more weight on the structure. 18 degrees would be adequate." Dutch countered, "I've built a dozen barns at that pitch. Never had one fail." Sam looked between them uncertainly. Miguel waited for Adelaide's response. Carter stood near the timber pile, listening but not intervening. Adelaide felt the familiar spike of doubt. Dutch had built a dozen barns, actual built them, with his hands, while she'd only watched Thomas work. Maybe she was being overly cautious. Maybe Thomas's methods were too conservative. Maybe, "I think we should go with 22.5, she said, forcing her voice steady. Dutch's jaw tightened. "You're adding 2 days of work and $50 in extra lumber for a theoretical problem." "It's not theoretical," Adelaide insisted. "It's physics. Weight distribution across angled supports. Thomas always said, 'Thomas Harper isn't here,'" Dutch said sharply. Then, seeing her face, he softened slightly. "Meaning no disrespect, ma'am. But I've got experience with Montana winters. 18 degrees will hold." The crew fell silent. Adelaide felt her certainty crumbling. She wasn't a builder. She was a widow playing at knowledge she didn't truly possess, making expensive decisions based on remembered conversations. What if she was wrong? What if her insistence on Thomas's methods wasted Carter's money and the men's time? "Let's take a break," Carter said quietly. "Discuss this later." The men dispersed. Adelaide stood alone near the frame, staring at her calculations without seeing them. Her hands trembled slightly. The December cold seemed to penetrate deeper than before. That night she barely slept. The wind howled against her rented room's thin walls, and she lay awake questioning every decision she'd made. Was she honoring Thomas's memory or hiding behind it? Was she protecting good craftsmanship or just clinging stubbornly to the past? The storm broke before dawn, heavy snow driven by fierce wind, the kind of weather that made Montana winter legendary. Adelaide rose in darkness and stood at her window watching the white chaos, thinking about roof pitch and weight loads and the terrible responsibility of being wrong. Morning brought news that traveled through town like wildfire. The Henderson Ranch's new barn had collapsed under the snow load. Its roof caved in. 6 months of work destroyed in a single night. When Miguel arrived with the wagon to fetch her, his face was grim. "The Henderson barn," he said. "Built this summer. Dutch worked on it." Adelaide's stomach dropped. What was the roof pitch? 18 degrees, Miguel said quietly, just like Dutch wanted for hours. The ride to Carter's ranch felt endless. Adelaide stared at her hands, remembering Dutch's confidence, her own doubt. If she'd given in. If she'd accepted his experience over Thomas's understanding when they arrived. Dutch was already examining their barn's frame, measuring angles with subdued intensity. He looked up as Adelaide approached, and something complex moved across his face. "You were right," he said. "About the pitch." Adelaide took no pleasure in the validation. Someone could have been hurt at Henderson's place. No one was, thank God, but the barn's a total loss. Dutch set down his measuring tool. "I've built at 18 degrees for years without problem. This winter's snow load is heavier than usual, but still I should have listened." "It's not about being right," Adelaide said, surprised at the firmness in her own voice. "It's about being responsible. These decisions matter. If I recommend something, it's not because I want to prove Thomas's method's superior. It's because I believe it's the safest, strongest way to build." She paused, then added more gently, "But I'm not infallible either. I'm just trying to apply what I learned." Dutch nodded slowly. Carter joined them, having heard the exchange. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "you told me when we started that you felt like an imposter, like you were just remembering, not knowing. Do you still feel that way?" Adelaide looked at the barn taking shape around them, the walls standing true, the frame solid, the work progressing according to principles she'd defended even when doubt clawed at her certainty. "I feel responsible," she said quietly. "These men trust my judgment. You're paying me to make good decisions. If I'm wrong, then we adjust and learn." Carter interrupted. "But you weren't wrong about the pitch. Your knowledge, whether it came from Thomas or from your own understanding, just prevented a disaster. That's not imposter work, Mrs. Harper. That's the real thing." The snow continued falling. Adelaide watched it accumulate on their steeply pitched frame, sliding off rather than building up, and felt the weight of both validation and responsibility. She'd been right this time. But what about next time? What about all the decisions still to come? By early January, the construction had stalled. The December storm had been followed by another, then another, until Montana lay buried under snow, and the work became impossible. The crew shifted to indoor tasks, repairing equipment, maintaining buildings, and Adelaide found herself with empty days and too much time to think. The doubt that had started with the roof pitch argument metastasized. Alone in her rented room, Adelaide replayed every decision she'd made, questioning each one. Had she really known what she was doing? Or had she just been lucky Dutch had years of experience? Sam understood Montana building better than she ever would. Miguel was learning, but from a teacher who might be teaching him wrong. Maybe Carter should hire a real carpenter, someone with credentials, training, actual hands-on expertise instead of second-hand knowledge filtered through a widow's memory. The thought circled her mind like a vulture. One bitter cold night, Adelaide sat at her small table with the canvas tool sack open before her. She'd been thinking about leaving, telling Carter she couldn't continue, returning what remained of her wages, finding some other way to survive the winter. It would be honest, at least. Better than pretending competence she didn't truly possess. She began packing the tools, wrapping each one carefully. The saw, the planes, the chisels. Each piece felt heavier than before, weighted with failure and foolishness. At the bottom of the sack, her fingers found something unexpected. A small leather notebook, forgotten in the canvas folds. Thomas's handwriting notebook, the one he'd kept for measurements and sketches. Adelaide opened it with trembling hands. The pages held his familiar script notes on lumber dimensions, calculations for various projects, rough sketches of joints and braces. She turned through them slowly, each page a window into his thinking. Near the middle, pressed between pages, she found a dried wildflower from their wedding day, and beneath it, a note she'd never seen before. Adelaide. It read in Thomas's careful hand. You understand this better than you think. You ask the right questions. See the important details. Trust what you've learned. Knowledge doesn't only live in the hands that first held it, it lives in every mind that comprehends it. You comprehend it. Love. Trust yourself. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. He'd written this years ago, maybe during one of their long evenings when he'd explained some aspect of his work and she'd protested she could never remember it all. He'd known, somehow, that she'd need this reassurance. Trust yourself. Adelaide closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest. The tools lay scattered on the table, half-packed for a retreat she now understood she couldn't make. Not because she had all the answers, but because running from responsibility wasn't the same as protecting people from inadequacy. She'd been adequate enough to recommend the roof pitch that prevented collapse, adequate enough to teach Miguel solid technique, adequate enough to earn the crew's respect through months of steady, careful judgment. Maybe adequate was enough. The next morning she arrived at the ranch earlier than usual. The crew was already gathered, stamping their feet against the cold, and they looked up in surprise when she approached. I need to say something, Adelaide began, her breath making clouds in the frozen air. I've been doubting myself, questioning whether I know enough to be doing this work. And the truth is, I don't know everything. I never will. I'm not Thomas Harper, and I never will be. Dutch shifted uncomfortably. Sam watched her with his kind, patient eyes. But I know this work is good, Adelaide continued, her voice growing stronger. I know because I learned from the best carpenter this territory ever saw. And he didn't just teach me techniques, he taught me how to think about building, how to ask whether something is right, not just whether it's done. And I won't dishonor his teaching by giving up when the work gets hard or my confidence falters. Miguel nodded slowly. Carter, standing near the barn entrance, crossed his arms and listened. So I'm asking you to be patient with me when I don't have immediate answers, Adelaide said, and to trust that when I do have answers, they come from genuine understanding, not just stubborn memory. Can you do that? Sam spoke first. Ma'am, we don't need a carpenter. We need someone who cares if the work is done right. That's you. Always has been. The Henderson barn collapse proved you knew what you were talking about. Dutch added gruffly, I was wrong to question the pitch. Won't make that mistake again. Miguel stepped forward. You're a good teacher, Mrs. Harper. I've learned more in 3 months than in 3 years before. That's not luck or memory. That's knowledge. Adelaide felt something unlock in her chest. The doubt didn't disappear. She suspected it never would entirely, but it no longer paralyzed her. All right then, she said. Let's get back to work. The January thaw came early that year, unexpected and welcome. Within days, the snow had melted enough to resume construction. The crew returned to the barn with renewed energy, and Adelaide directed them with a confidence born not from certainty, but from acceptance of her own limitations and strengths. They were going to finish this barn, and it was going to be good work. Late February brought crystalline cold and clear skies. The barn stood nearly complete, its walls enclosed, its steeply pitched roof solid against the Montana weather. Only the final details remained hanging the doors, checking every joint and beam, ensuring the whole structure met the standards Adelaide had maintained throughout construction. She arrived before dawn on the final inspection day, the tool sack heavy in her hands. The barn rose against the lightening sky, more beautiful than she'd imagined it would be. 4 months ago, this had been an empty foundation. Now it stood as testament to knowledge applied, principles honored, work done right. Adelaide set the sack down and removed Thomas's cherry wood level. She'd saved it for this moment, the final verification that everything stood true. Starting at the southeast corner, she began a methodical examination. Every post, every beam, every joist received attention. She placed the level against surfaces, watched the bubble settle into perfect center, nodded with satisfaction. The walls stood plumb. The floor lay flat. The roof timbers aligned precisely. Thomas's initials caught the early light as she worked her way around the interior, carved into the cherry wood handle. She ran her thumb across them, feeling the familiar curves. "You'd be proud of this barn," she said quietly to the empty air. But even as she said it, Adelaide realized the truth was more complex. Thomas would be proud. Yes, but this barn wasn't his work, it was hers. His knowledge had informed it. His standards had shaped it. But every decision had been filtered through her own judgment, applied to problems he'd never faced. She placed the level along the final beam, the one that would support the hayloft. The bubble settled perfectly center. Everything was true. Adelaide stood in the middle of the completed barn and let herself feel the weight of accomplishment. She wasn't Thomas's shadow or the keeper of his ghost. She was Adelaide Harper, and she'd supervised the construction of this barn through her own competence, earned respect through her own steady judgment, transformed grief into purpose through her own determination. Knowledge had value beyond the hands that first held it. Thomas had believed that. He'd written it in his notebook for her to find when she needed the reminder most. But until this moment, standing in a barn built by her direction, Adelaide hadn't fully understood what he meant. She heard boots on the threshold and turned to see Carter entering, his expression serious as he surveyed the interior. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "may I see your inspection results?" Adelaide showed him the level, still perfectly centered against the beam. "Everything's true. The work is solid." Carter walked the perimeter slowly, running his hands along joints, testing the floor, examining the roof supports. He took his time, thorough and careful. While Adelaide waited with her heart beating steady, finally he returned to where she stood in the center. "This is finer work than I imagined," he said. "Better than my father's barn, better than most buildings in the territory. You've done something remarkable here." "The crew did the building," Adelaide said, "but you gave them knowledge worth following." Carter paused, then continued. "Mrs. Harper, I have other properties that need management, buildings that require maintenance, new construction that needs oversight. I'd like to offer you permanent work supervising all of it. Fair wages, steady employment, and the respect your knowledge deserves." Adelaide looked around the barn one more time. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching motes of sawdust still floating in the air. The space smelled of fresh timber and honest work. Outside, she could hear the crew arriving, their voices carrying in the cold morning. She thought about the woman who'd stood in Morrison's general store 4 months ago, selling her husband's tools to survive another week. She thought about grief and knowledge and the unexpected ways life transformed both. "I accept your offer, Mr. Carter," she said. His face broke into a rare smile. "Excellent. We'll discuss terms this afternoon. For now, let's show the crew what they've accomplished." The men gathered as sunlight filled the barn. They stood together, Sam and Dutch and Miguel and Carter and Adelaide, in the structure they'd created. And Adelaide felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. She felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had purpose, like the future held possibility instead of just survival. The knowledge Thomas had shared with her hadn't died with him. It had grown, transformed, become something new in her hands and mind and voice. And now it would continue growing, shaping buildings across Montana, living on through work well done. March came to Montana with the smell of thaw and promise. Adelaide Harper sat in her small office on Carter's ranch, reviewing plans for a new bunkhouse that needed building come summer. The space was plain but functional: a desk, a chair, shelves lined with notebooks and references, and on the wall above her workspace, Thomas's cherry wood level. She no longer kept it in the canvas sack. It sat in a place of honor, visible and accessible. Still a working tool, but also a reminder of how far she'd traveled from that November afternoon in Morrison's General Store, outside her window. The barn stood solid against the brightening sky. Every day she saw it, Adelaide felt a quiet satisfaction. The structure had weathered February's storms without trouble, the steep roof shedding snow exactly as predicted, the joints holding firm. The whole building standing as proof that knowledge applied with care created lasting value. Carter had been true to his word. She now oversaw construction and maintenance across his properties, earning wages that allowed her to rent a better room and begin saving for the future. Men across the territory had heard about the widow who supervised the Carter barn, and 3 other ranchers had approached her about consulting on their projects. She was building a reputation, not as Thomas Harper's widow, but as Adelaide Harper, knowledgeable and reliable, someone whose judgment could be trusted. Miguel had become her unofficial apprentice, soaking up technique and theory with the enthusiasm of genuine interest. Just last week, he'd shown her a repair he'd completed independently, a complex joint that would have challenged experienced carpenters, and the work had been flawless. "You're a good teacher," he'd said, echoing words from months before. Adelaide had smiled, remembering when teaching seemed impossible, when she'd felt like an imposter playing at knowledge she didn't truly possess. Now she knew better. Knowledge lived wherever understanding resided. It didn't matter that her hands hadn't built the barn, her mind had shaped it. Her voice had guided it. Her judgment had ensured its quality. That was enough. A knock on the doorframe interrupted her planning. Sam stood there with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, got a question about the bunkhouse foundation. Could you take a look?" "Of course." Adelaide rose, reaching automatically for the level on the wall, then pausing. She didn't need it for this consultation, but she liked the feel of it in her hands, the solid weight of connection to everything Thomas had taught her. She ran her finger along his carved initials one more time. Tish. The man who'd believed knowledge had value beyond the hands that first held it. The man who'd written in his notebook that she understood better than she thought. He'd been right. But it had taken a barn and a winter and a journey through doubt to help Adelaide understand what he'd known all along, outside. The March sun warmed the air with hints of spring. Adelaide walked across the yard to where Sam waited, the level tucked under her arm, ready to apply knowledge to new problems, to teach what she'd learned, to continue building. In Morrison's General Store that afternoon, she stopped to purchase supplies for the bunkhouse project. The storekeeper, the same man who'd counted her desperate coins 4 months prior, now greeted her with respect. "Mrs. Harper, good to see you." "Heard the Carter barn came through the winter beautifully." "It did," Adelaide said, selecting nails and hardware with practiced efficiency. "Lot of folks talking about your work." Morrison continued. "You've made quite a name for yourself." Adelaide paid for her purchases with money she'd earned, watching Morrison count it with the same efficiency he'd shown counting her poverty coins. But everything was different now. She wasn't selling her past to survive. She was purchasing materials to build the future. As she left the store, supplies in hand, Adelaide paused on the wooden sidewalk to look back at the place where everything had changed. The window still showed frost patterns in winter. The stove still radiated warmth. But the woman reflected in that glass bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who'd sold her husband's tools piece by piece. That woman had believed she had nothing left of value. This woman knew better. She walked toward the wagon where Miguel waited to drive her back to the ranch. And as they rode through the afternoon light, Adelaide thought about the barn standing solid on its foundation, about the projects still to come, about the knowledge she carried and would continue to share. Some things were meant to be kept, she reflected, not as monuments to what was lost, but as foundations for what comes next. The level rested beside her on the wagon seat, Thomas's initials catching the sun, still showing true after all these years, still balanced, still valuable, still building something new.